right.
And good evening. Welcome once again to Branco Broadcast. My name is Bob Branco. On this rainy Columbus Day evening, our guest this evening, most of you know him, John Pavao, class of 1973 from Perkins. He's done a lot of things in his lifetime so far, and he's here to talk about a lot of that. Welcome, John.
Thank you, Bob, and good evening to everyone. I'm just going to start off with a little bit of background about myself. I went to Perkins from 1961, starting in first grade all the way through grade 12, and I was born in Fall River, Massachusetts, and moved to the town of Dighton, which is right near Fall River. Moved to the town of Dighton when I was about 15 months old. We moved into a house that my dad had built, and we lived out in the country in Dighton on a dead-end street, and about 30 acres of property between fields and woods, so it was quite a variety of settings to get used to and play around in when I was young. And that was one of the reasons why my parents moved out to the country, because I was one of a family of 7. I had 3 brothers and 3 sisters, a younger brother, a twin sister, and everybody else was older. So I was free to run around outside because we didn't have to worry about traffic on the road or anything like that. And one of the things that friends and relatives of my parents were concerned about, they'd always say, well, aren't you worried that John's going to run into a tree or something if he's running around outside by himself? And my dad's answer was, if he runs into it once, he'll watch out for it the next time. And, I thought that was kind of a telling statement, and I think the way he chose to handle my situation is one of the reasons why I was able to be successful, because he was willing to let me try things and explore and show me things. Another thing that I can remember when I was really young is since there were 7 of us in the family, we would, needless to say, drink quite a bit of milk. So my dad would pick up milk at a local farm. Every day he would pick up a milk can that had 8 quarts of milk in it, and he had 2 of these cans. So he would drop one off as he picked up the full one. And so once in a while I would go with him, and he would take me into the barn and show me how the whole process was going on, the milking and everything. And one day he was trying to show me how to milk a cow the way he did when he was young, because when he was young, he was brought up on a farm. And he said, before I went to school, I had to milk 2 cows. And we didn't have milking machines. He said we had to do it by hand. So he was trying to show me how to do it, but that's one thing I could never master. I never developed the technique to milk a cow by hand. So when it came time to go to school, I went to Perkins, and it was a little bit of a change, because I couldn't understand at first why I had to go to school during the week and stay there while the rest of the family went to public school, but I went to Perkins. So it took a little getting used to, but I did come home just about every weekend. So I got to Perkins, as I said, in 1961, and I would say probably by the time I got into the upper school, I had a pretty good idea that I had an interest in kind of some kind of background, a career, maybe getting into, it was either going to be engineering or computers, because when I was in 8th grade, I was talked into going to a radio club meeting, and Mr. Vargas he kept saying, you really should come. I think you'd like it. So I finally did. I went to the meeting, and what really did it is going down to the ham station and listening to another person operating. And once I heard that, I said, oh, that sounds like a lot of fun. So that kind of sparked my interest in some kind of technical career because I found that I seemed to have an aptitude for math when I was in the, let's say, 7th, 8th grade. I never had much of a problem with it. And when I got into my junior year at Perkins, they had a basic programming course that was just starting up. And the teacher I had was Miss Cambridge, and she was just learning programming along with us. So she came up with some ideas for some simple programs to write when we were first starting. And then after a while, she just said, you seem to be picking this up pretty well. She said, just come up with an idea on what you want to write a program to do, and I'll listen to your idea, and if I like it, you can do it. So she pretty much let me come up with ideas, and I really enjoyed it. And she was the one, when it came time to decide what to do after graduating from Perkins, she was a big factor in my determination of what to do in college, because I was originally considering going into electrical engineering, but I was really worried about how I would do a lot of the work, because I knew there'd be a lot of schematics and design diagrams and all kinds of stuff like that. And I was a bit apprehensive about that, not knowing what I was going to do. And she said, I know they don't have much technology nowadays for computer programming. We had a pretty simple setup at Perkins. It was a teletype with an MIT Braille Embosser to get the listings on. But she said, I know in a few years there probably will be some developments, and it will make it easier for you to do the job of programming. So I thought that was very insightful, especially early in the 1970s. There really wasn't that much in the way of technology to aid in blind programmers being able to do the job. So I thought, well, that might be a good thing, because I did enjoy writing the programs. And so that's what I decided to do. So when I graduated from Perkins in 1973, I had been accepted at Worcester Polytech in Worcester, Mass, and I knew that I was going to try to go in and get a degree in computer science. So the big adjustment was going from Perkins to WPI, having never been exposed to a classroom setting with all sighted people and the material being geared towards sighted people. It was a big adjustment, because as far as getting around the campus, it wasn't a big deal, because the campus is not a big campus. It's, 30 to 40 acres, so there's not a lot of area to cover. And I had gone there a few times before school started in the fall of 1973 to get oriented, mainly to find where my dorm was, what room I was going to be in, most importantly, where the cafeteria was, where my first few classes were going to be held. So I got those locations learned before I went there. But the big adjustment was when I did get there, how do I meet people or, get comfortable with my classmates or people in the dorm? At that time, and I'm really not the most outgoing type of person. And at that time, I was a little apprehensive, not knowing how would I get to meet people, and or just to start up a conversation. But it was surprising to me that it didn't really take too long, because I started to think about it, and I thought, most everybody else here probably, among the members of the freshman class, are probably in the same situation where they don't really know many people either. So a lot of times we would have these dorm meetings at the beginning of the year. They would bring everybody together. We'd have floor meetings, and they'd explain the rules and everything, and they would have everybody say who they were and where they were from. So it was a good way to get things started. And then another place was in the cafeteria, when you'd have to go in and just randomly find a place to sit. and sometimes, it would be interesting to find out what other people sat down at the table after the meal started. So sometimes they'd start on a topic that I might know something about, let's say the Red Sox or whatever it may be, and that would kind of be another icebreaker. So that was one of the adjustments. The other adjustment was the actual class setting, especially in classes dealing with a lot of board work. A good example would be calculus, let's say. And I can remember going into my first class, sitting there, and wondering what all the squeaks on the blackboard meant, because they really didn't mean much to me. So I spoke to the professor after class, and I asked him. I said, "Do you have any suggestions?" I said, "I know you've probably never dealt with teaching a blind person, but if you have any suggestions, I'd be interested in knowing what you think might help to make things easier." One of the things that I did ask all the professors was if it was okay to bring a tape recorder into the class. Well, I didn't want to just bring one in without asking. So I did that, and so this professor that I had asked about the math and what would make it easier, his suggestion was, he said, even if you don't understand the material, he said, I would recommend reading ahead, a chapter ahead of what we're going to be covering, or at least read it before we talk about it in class. So I did that, and it was somewhat helpful because he would, and he did make an attempt to describe things a little bit, but not overdoing it to slow things down, but he did become a little more descriptive. The other problem was math books or calculus. The calculus book that I had was not available in Braille, but it was available on tape. And that type of material is very difficult to follow when it's being read to you, when you listen to it in audio form, because some of these equations were very confusing because you had brackets within parentheses and that kind of stuff. And eventually I did get a Braille book. The same professor who had given me the advice, I did end up taking a couple of courses with him and got to know him fairly well. And he was able to get the school to buy this particular calculus book in Braille, and because it's one of the introductory books that they use. So he said, if we get another student, they may be able to use it also, because it was a standard textbook. So once we did get that book, it was much easier to at least have the equations written, and and we could understand things a little easier. Because what I would have to do from the audio book, would have to transcribe a lot of the stuff into Braille, which took a lot of time, and but that was also helpful, just trying to do that. Another problem that I ran into was getting some of the computer science books on time, because I would typically, if I knew I was going to take a particular course ahead of time, I would go to that professor and ask if he had the book list available. And I can remember asking one about a course that I was going to be taking in September, during the summer, and I said, what books will you be using? And he said, I can tell you the books. He said, but they haven't been published yet. He said, they're going to come out at the end of August or just in time for school to start. So that was a problem. And but I did end up using readers, and what became very helpful is once I got to know a few students, I would know some students in the class, and some of them would be willing to read, and several in particular enjoyed doing it because they said, explaining it to you gives me the sense of how much I know about it. If you start asking questions, if I can answer those questions, then I'll feel better about how I'm doing as well. So that was helpful. And then the mechanics of actually doing the programming was another problem that we had to work around for a bit, because the main piece of equipment that I would use was again, the MIT Braille Embosser, the same type that I had at Perkins, the state of Massachusetts had purchased one for me to use at WPI. Unfortunately, it had a lot of moving parts, and it required a lot of maintenance and was always breaking down. And as you know, bureaucracies move slowly, so it would take a while for the bill to be paid after the repair had been made. And in some cases, another problem would occur before the first problem had been paid for. So the technician would be reluctant to come out and fix it if he hadn't been paid for the first time. So that was another hang-up. But what I ended up doing on a lot of the courses for the programming is I'd have to just sit down at a regular terminal. They did have two types of terminals. They had CRT displays, and they had regular terminals that used paper, a wide roll, almost like a teletype, but it would record everything. So as I typed in the program, it would be printed, and then when I ran it or tried to compile it, all the error messages would be printed out. So what I would do is sit down, write out my program in Braille, and then sit down and type it in on the terminal, compile it, and try to let it go and determine what the errors were and everything. And then I would log off, go take it to a friend of mine, and he'd look at it and say, oh, you got an error on such and such a line. You're going to have to go in and correct it. So there was a lot of running back and forth, but we managed to do that. So there, it was trials and tribulations, but I managed to make it through and graduate. And then after graduating, as you probably saw in the material, I ended up being the first blind student to graduate from WPI. So after graduating, that was definitely a satisfying feeling to finally finish and get that done. And then it came time to try to find a job. So I ended up writing up a resume, cover letters, just sending out a bunch of different resumes. And I was starting to wonder if all the companies used the same book for writing their responses, because they all pretty much sounded the same. It was the type of thing where, as if it would always say, although you have excellent qualifications, we do not have a position available at this time, but we will keep your resume on file and let you know if a position becomes available. So it was getting to be a little depressing to see those same types of letters coming in all the time. But eventually I did get a chance. A friend of mine who I had met through ham radio, he convinced his boss to hire me because he knew that I was looking for a job, and he said, I think we have a job that would probably be a good fit. So he talked his boss into hiring me on what they called an accepted position, which meant it was a temporary position. This was for the Naval Undersea Warfare Center in Newport, Rhode Island, and they had a program where they would hire people on these accepted positions, but they were only good for 700 hours. And it was a good way if they were concerned about whether or not this was going to work out. If it didn't work out, they would just let the 700-hour position expire, and that would be the end of it. So my friend Tom convinced his boss to try this, so that's what we did. And Tom was very helpful in figuring out how to modify equipment, and so he was a good person to get involved with in the situation, and he was probably the biggest advocate and the reason why I was hired. And then once I did get hired, after a month or so, his boss was happy, and he said, well, we can convert it to a permanent position. So that's what happened. I ended up working at the Naval Undersea Warfare Center from October of 1979, and I retired in July of 2008. So it was a nice 29 years, and had quite a few different types of projects. Our main type of work was doing software development for they call them the in-water tracking systems, where we would develop tracking systems for test ranges and the tracking systems included hardware that was mounted underwater and signaling devices were put on the actual targets that were being tracked. So this was for test purposes. And they would emit pings, and these pings would be sent to hydrophones that are mounted on the ocean floor. And then those signals are wired back to shore, and signal processing equipment processes it, and they know when these pings arrive at the hydrophones at precise times. And then based on the timing of all these signals, the software would actually compute the position of the target in the water. So we did all the tracking software, and when I first started, I worked on displays, and to actually display both the track of the target as well as data about the track, position, speed, direction, that type of thing. And so that was one of the things I did, and then after a while, I also developed some simulation software that would do just the opposite of what the tracking system does. In order to give the tracking system some test data, the simulator would actually do the reverse and say, okay, the target is here, so if a target is in this position, what would the times of arrival be at each one of the hydrophones in order to generate a position that to track the target? And then we'd feed that data to the tracking program just to test it. So that was another interesting thing. And I also did some smaller projects involving controlling of equipment using microprocessors to track status of the equipment. There was one package that we had that was in the water that had tape recorders that could be turned on remotely by a radio signal. So we had to have a program that would receive this signal and say, okay, this is the signal. That means, if you get a particular code, turn on the tape recorder and start recording data. Or another sensor might say, there's a leak in the equipment. Send a signal ashore to have somebody come out and check to make sure this thing doesn't fill with water and sink. So all this was controlled by a program, and I ended up writing the code for that type of system. So there was quite a variety of things to do. And especially in the early years, I worked in a smaller group of about a dozen people, a combination of programmers, engineers, technicians, and it was a fun group. But as time went on, they reorganized a few times, and so that changed the whole atmosphere. And it did change, and I have to admit it was a lot more fun in the earlier days when the group was smaller and there was a lot more camaraderie, I think, among the group that I worked in. And, and then what also happened, too, is there was a difference in the way they treated how projects were funded. When I first started in the late 70s, the atmosphere was completely different as far as how much money was available for the projects. And then as time went on, as it is in all other agencies, funding has become more of a problem, so it did affect how things were done. Another thing that also changed quite a bit was the type of equipment available. When I first started, we would procure equipment from projects at the end of the year if they had any money left. My boss was very good at saying, John, what would you like to get? He said, if we have the money, I'll try to get it. And that worked out fairly well when money was available. But then what became very helpful, the government came up with a office called the Computer and Electronics Accommodation Program. And it was first for the Defense Department, where anyone who worked in the Defense Department could submit a request. As long as the supervisor approved it, they would pay for any special equipment that was needed. So I was able to get Braille displays, a scanning system to do character recognition of documents, and that was another thing that really changed as technology changed. When I first started working there, if I was given a work assignment, I would have to sit down with the person I was doing the work for, and we would talk about it, and I would take notes and write a lot of things down on the specifications, what was required, what I would get, because a lot of the programs we wrote were like, as we call them, black box type programs, where you would be given input, and given that input, you're supposed to provide a certain data set, let's say. So I would have to write down all the specifications, in both areas, what I would be receiving and what I was supposed to produce. And then we had to write out highlights every week that we would submit. So those would have to be just typed out. So I'd had a regular typewriter. I'd put the paper in and type up my weekly report. But as time went on and technology improved, everybody got a PC. So that's when, it was much easier to receive work projects. We'd get electronic data files or documents. And, when everything was done in text, it was fine. Same thing with writing programs. With the first PCs, it was DOS, so everything was text, no problems. I could get access to anything. Anything that came up on the screen, I had a way of getting text because I had the refreshable Braille display hooked up, and whatever was sent to the display would also be sent to the screen would also be sent to the display, so I could verify what was going on. And then when Windows came along, that presented another problem until JAWS for Windows came along, because initially Windows was not very accessible to a blind person. And then when JAWS came along, it made Windows, because there was originally a DOS version of JAWS, and then JAWS for Windows came out. And I always worry whenever you read information about a program or application that's available, I always get worried whenever they say, note the beautiful graphics and display, and I say, uh-oh, that's not going to be good. And usually that's true. So what happened as I got later into my career, they changed again into how programming was going to be done, and they were using what they call an integrated development environment, which meant that if you had a group of people working on a project, you would have to check out the portion of code that you were working on, and while that was checked out, nobody else could touch it. So that was okay, but the particular system they were using was completely graphically oriented, and even when doing diagnosing programs, when you're debugging programs, it wouldn't come out with a text message. Instead, a little icon would pop up on the screen, a red icon if there was an error, or, yellow if there was something else, a warning. So there was no software available that would make it accessible, and that was what really made life difficult. I began to fight the tools rather than do the work, and I spent more time dealing with how to do it than actually doing it. And that was right around the time I retired, and that's pretty much what kind of moved me in that direction of retiring. I thought after a while, I said, I don't know if I really want to deal with this anymore. And there were several other reasons. My dad was in poor health, and I thought maybe I'd rather spend a little more time with him if I can, and if I can do it, I'll do it. So that's what I did. I ended up retiring in 2008, and it was the best thing I ever did. I was able to spend a couple of more years with my dad before he passed away. Spent a little more time with him that I wouldn't have spent had I been working, and so that was another thing that worked out. Another thing that technology helped me out with is ham radio. One of the best things, or the best thing that ever happened to me through ham radio was meeting my wife, Laurie, through ham radio. We ended up meeting on ham radio, and I'd like to spend most of my time operating Morse code, and she was learning at the time, so I agreed to. I always am interested when I hear someone has an interest in learning Morse code, because there are fewer and fewer of us around. A lot of people don't like to spend the time doing it and feel that they won't be able to do it. But she and I spent a lot of time chatting on Morse code, got to know each other a little bit, and I think we probably chatted for a couple of months before we met each other for the first time, and met a few times, and after a while, the rest is history. We married in November of 1988, and we've been living here in Somerset since May of 1989 in the same house. So It's been as I said, the best thing that ever happened to me. So I guess I've rambled on long enough. If anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Yeah.
Yes.
Steve, I think that's wonderful. I know 3 students from our class tried to get into WPI, and I'm kind of jealous because they had better technology than I had in '82 at Rhode Island College. We were still using punch cards. They finally got the terminals, and I know one thing that gave me a lot of trouble was flowcharts, and I think you did better than I did as far as early on you talked to the professors about help, and you know I did that, but I was a little stubborn, and I thought I could do it all, but I think what you were saying about the changes in technologies in the programming are really, you know, I have heard there's blind programmers out there. I did it, well, it's over 10 years ago, but I would like to dabble in it again if I could. And, you know, you're just talking the computer stuff. I mean, that really, you know, at Perkins, I saw Bob on his terminal, and I said, I want to do computers. And it was just a great time, especially in those old DOS days and, you know.
Oh, yeah, that's true, because with DOS, you had full access to everything. You knew what was going on, and I would always tell people this, and it's amazing how that's changed, where a good example is when people first had PCs, you know, you had the floppies. A lot of systems would come with 2 floppy drives, so if you had to copy, you just put 2 disks in, copy from one to the other. And then the hard drive came along, and they said, wow, 10 megabytes, you know. And then you go to 20, and then they'd say 50 is all you're going to ever need, you know, and you say some of these programs now, you know, that's not even getting started. That's just the manual for some of these programs that you get now, you know, where memory and disk space is so cheap. But with DOS, you had full access to everything, and when programs were installed, they would tell you what they were doing. You know how with DOS, you used to have the BAT file, and programs would go in and modify that when they were installed. Yeah. And they would tell you what they did.
I was you in '82 because I think you could have helped me out a lot. I did all right, but as far as like today, I mean, I don't want to do computer science as a career necessarily, but I just would like to dabble in it. You know,
right?
Is that possible? Because I know you were saying because I ran into that in I don't know, I guess early 2000s. Everything was going GUI and like you're saying the IDEs and all that crazy stuff. So,
yep, that's exactly, yeah. And I never really got comfortable with it because all the major programming that I did was, you know, it was, at the time, all the scientific stuff was done in Fortran.
Oh, yeah.
And that's what we did. You know, we did Fortran. All the tracking systems software was written in Fortran. Well, the original one was written, in assembly language. The first project that I worked on, we did assembly language, but that was all text-based. And then
still a lot of work, though.
Oh yeah, it's a lot of work. And then you mentioned flowcharts. That was another one of my concerns too, because I said, well, how am I going to do this? And then I thought about it, and I ended up talking to a couple of people, and I said, well, all a flowchart is, you know, it's a general description of what each of the functions in the program, you know, what they do. And so I started. Somebody suggested, they said, well, why don't you do, they called it the top-down approach, where you say, you know, and you go take that route and write an outline in textual form and say, you know, take the major function, the algorithm of the program and say, okay, what do you want to do with this program? And then you say, okay, I want to add 2 numbers, and get a third as the output, let's say. And then you break it down and say, okay, well, how do I get those numbers? And you say, well, you input those numbers. And you know, it was just trying to work out an outline in text form to try to describe how it was going to do it, how it was going to be done. And I found that to be pretty helpful.
Yeah, and my last question is, are you familiar with any of the stuff going on now with programming, like as far as blind people doing it? I mean,
I'm kind of out of touch with what the latest is. You know, when I retired, I really the only thing that I tried to do a little of was a little web page programming. Yeah. Our Lions Club had a website, and I tried doing a little HTML, and then I ended up using Front Page to do some of it. But it was still, I had to have some help have somebody look at it. You know, Laurie would say, oh yeah, you know, I'd say, well, how's this text? And she'd say, oh, it's a little, doesn't look that great. You know, you might want to do this or that. And, you know, I've never really, the other thing that I played around with, and this is not really programming, but, like all the stuff for the Alumni Association, I use spreadsheets to manage all that stuff too.
Yeah.
And that's helpful. But, you know, as far as what the latest is on accessible IDE programming or and Java, that was the thing. When, like I was saying, we were doing Fortran programming, but then around the time that I retired, or a year or two before I retired, they decided to convert all the tracking software from Fortran to Java.
Yeah, that's a big flip.
And that was where they used the IDE environment, and that's where I ran into problems, and I was unable to do it, and, you know, they said, well, they started having me do all kinds of other work that I was not, it was stuff that nobody else wanted to do, but they said, well, we need somebody to do this, and after a while, that kind of, is what pushed me toward, since I was able to, and in a financial position where I could, I said, well, I'm not happy with this. I just don't enjoy it anymore, and I retired at that time.
Oh,
yeah,
thanks.
I had a question.
Yeah.
Me going, yeah, last night I was listening to 60 Minutes now. The Shake Shack in New York City, they're going to have a thing where you're going to, when you pay, I guess they're trying to go cashless, they're going to go touch screen, and I'm just wondering if that violates the ADA for those of us.
Yeah, that's a good question. And that's another one, too, because with the EPA, or not the EPA, the ADA, when you have like websites that are accessed by the public, you know, like Social Security is a good example, or any of these government websites, they all have to be compliant, and you notice they'll have a link that says accessibility, and in most cases when you go to that link, it brings you to a less cluttered website that you can access. But that was the thing that I ran into at work, where those rules apply to the public, but within the agencies, they didn't apply. So it was, you know, they didn't really follow their own rules. So that's why a lot of this stuff was inaccessible, and they didn't really.
You use iPhone, though, John?
Oh, yeah, iPhone. Oh, yeah, I do.
Yeah.
And that is really, that, you know, as expensive as Apple products are, they do seem to make a pretty good effort to try to remain accessible. And, you know, Apple does. The problem that I run into is some apps are not really designed to be very accessible with VoiceOver.
And I guess McDonald's in New Bedford's going to do.
Yeah, but what I found to be very helpful, you probably know that Apple has a special accessibility number you can call.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're very helpful on that number. They'll, you know, especially they'll even remotely access and watch what you're doing just to see if they can help.
Do you know Johnny Oliveira?
I don't.
Yeah, he's very good with, Bob's had him on his guest. I guess he's very good with the app. He's very knowledgeable about Apple products.
Yeah. Yeah, the other one.
We'll go around. We're going to start off with Steve.
Oh, I already had my turn.
All right, then we'll go to Lauren. Lauren Casey.
Oh, Bob, I joined late.
All right,
Jeff. I must have put that one to sleep, Bob.
What's that?
I said I must have put that one to sleep.
I don't know. Glenn Grimes, you're next.
Oh, I've already done my turn.
All right, Lauren, are you there? All right, Marcy. Marcy. All right, Tricia.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. I don't really have any questions, but it was very interesting, and I thank you very much for being our guest tonight, because it was very interesting hearing about all that stuff and all the accessibility issues you had. So the rest of us know we are not alone with unaccessible things, even though, you know, it was quite a few years ago when you got started, but I admire you for keeping at it and doing what you do, and I thank you.
Oh, well, thank you very much for listening.
Okay, Cleora.
Yes. Well, I can relate to the problems that you had. I had a similar situation, and you hung on longer than I did. I retired in 2005. I said, there's enough of this. But I have wondered, using my iPhone and all of these apps that are on there and everything, I've kind of wondered if there's a place for us there, writing those apps.
Well, I don't know about writing the apps, but there is. I got an email recently I saw from Jerry Berria from Vibug sent one out recently, and it was about a blog that Jonathan Mosen puts out. I don't know if you've heard the name before.
Yeah, I'm going to be listening to him at 8. He's going to be talking about the new iPhone, the Apple.
Oh, is he?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah, okay.
That's the world. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, because he usually does a nice job on those things.
Mm-hmm.
He goes into all the details, and he came out with an email about the latest iOS 11 situation where with email there's a problem.
Yep.
That in the past when you would go into email on the iPhone, if you had a list of messages, you would just double tap the message and it would open, and you read it. And then you go down to the bottom, you hit the delete button, and you go from message to message. Or let's say you wanted to, instead of, you knew you wanted to read these messages, but maybe not all at the same time, you could double tap a message, open it, and then close it to delete before deleting it. But now, you know how you have the option where if you're on a message and you can flick to change the action from activate, highlight, mark as read, delete, that type of thing. Mm-hmm. Typically, it would always come up in the default of activate, so you could always double tap it and never have to worry about deleting it. It would always open. But now what happens is if you go into mail and you delete a message, set it to delete, double tap, then you go to the next message and you want to just open it. If you double tap it without checking that action, it may still be sitting on the delete action, and you can accidentally delete it.
Mm-hmm.
Boy.
So he said
Do you have iOS 11 now, John? Yeah.
Yeah, that's iOS 11 that does that.
Do you have 11? Have you upgraded?
I did. I got it unintentionally. I had a problem with my iPhone last week, and I had to restore it. And I keep my backup on the computer, so I restored it from iTunes. But before doing that, I had gone to the Apple Store, and my phone was completely dead. I have an iPhone 6. And it was completely dead. It wouldn't charge. It didn't show any signs of life. So I brought it to the Apple Store, and they said, "Well, we'll plug it in." Well, they said, "Well, maybe there's some dust in the Lightning port." So she cleaned it out. She said, "We'll plug it in and see what happens. We'll wait 10 minutes." She said, "Sometimes it takes a while." It didn't come back to life. So she said, "Well, let me try one thing." She said, "Do you have it backed up?" I said, "I do have a backup." She said, "Well, I'll do a reset and see what happens." Did the reset, still nothing. Still showed no signs of life. So I said, well, I'll take it home. I'll think about what I want to do. So a few hours later, I plugged it in at home, let it sit there for a while. It came back to life again. So I charged it up overnight, and then I had to do a restore. But when I did a restore, it brought in the latest version of iOS. So I got iOS 11.
How's that working?
And it's working okay. Yes, that's the only problem I've heard about. But other than that, it seems to be pretty much like the previous version.
All right.
Well, I'm glad I didn't update then. I got it. It came up wanted to update yesterday, and I told it no, and then it went ahead and tried to get me to agree to the license, and so I decided not to agree, and it hasn't bothered me anymore. But iOS 10, it has taken me, I guess, from the time I installed iOS 10 until a few months ago to figure out how to get the messages. Before it was, I don't remember how it was before, but it was a lot easier. Now it's a pain to get to messages. To even find out you've got them, it's just, I don't know.
I don't like when they completely change the layout or how things appear. It didn't seem like they did it too much in, from 10 to 11. It didn't seem to changed that much. One thing they did, I haven't tried it yet. They have a new application called Files, where you supposedly can see what all your files are on the phone that various applications use. But I haven't had the time to read up about it. But there's a new one that shows up now called Files.
Well, it turned out that in Messages, when you first open up a new message, it goes to the end, and goes to that message. But then if you go back and try to look at a previous message, it rearranges everything. And so,
Yeah.
It's just insanity. And it's insanity to sighted people. From what I hear, it's insanity to sighted people as well as us. They have trouble with it, too.
Yep. You know what else I find interesting, too, is if you have an application that works on an iPad or an iPhone, sometimes you see some different layouts on the, since there's more screen available on the iPad. A good example is Contacts. If you go to Contacts in an iPad, all the names are on the left-hand side, so you can double tap a name, it opens up that contact, but all the information shows up on the right-hand side instead of like on the iPhone when you hit a name, it opens up that screen and you get that. So on the iPad, you see both the list of names, and then it'll tell you when you get to the one that's open, it'll say selected, but you see them on the left side, and you get all the information of the current one that's open on the right-hand side. Another thing, though, that has been a nice advance in technology is I have a thermostat at home that's it's called the Eco B Thermostat, and that one responds to Siri commands. So I can tell the thermostat, I can tell Siri, set my thermostat to 72 degrees, and it'll set my thermostat. Or I can say, what's the temperature of my living room, and it'll tell me what the temperature is. And I can do it remotely as well. Since I have an Apple TV, I can remotely check my thermostat wherever I am. I can just say, what's the temperature of my living room? You can turn the heat up or down remotely. So in the wintertime, if we're away from home for a while, I'll turn it down knowing that we're not home, but then shortly before we get home, I'll tell it resume schedule, and it'll go back to the regular setting, and the house will be nice and warm when I get home.
Yeah. Well, I know a fellow, can't think of his name, right, Jack Hickman. He just loves that. He'll be out working all day, and when he's ready to head home, he just accesses his thermostat and, it's comfortable when he gets home.
Right. Yeah, and it works well. And what's good about this thermostat is it has, not only do you have the thermostat, but you can set up wireless sensors in different rooms, so it will, and the sensors will detect motion. So they know, based on the motion, it'll favor that sensor. It'll put more weight to what that sensor is reading, figuring that, there's somebody in that room, so we want to make sure that we keep the room close to whatever the setting is on the thermostat, and not worry as much about the other rooms that aren't occupied.
Oh, that's a great.
That's nice.
Yeah,
it's a nice setup, and I don't have that many, but you can have as many as 32 sensors.
Well, that would be great for me because I spend most of my time, in the back in the bedroom, but because of the way mine is set up, I have to keep the rest of the house about 3 degrees cooler than I want it to be in my room. Because the direct sun coming in, it heats up this room, or in the winter it's colder than the other part, that would be all to see about getting that. I have a thermostat right now, but so this Eco thermostat would have to replace that, right?
Right, it would be a replacement, and it's called the Eco B. It's made by a company in Canada, and it responds to both Siri and Alexa also.
Really?
Yep.
That's nice.
Uh-huh.
All righty. Any other questions, Karen? Lauren?
Hey guys, we may be a couple minutes late. I'm going to go.
Marcy? Karen? Lauren? Marty? Any questions?
John, I have a question for you, and I may have missed out on this, but when did you get your first computer with speech?
Oh, let's see. The first computer with speech. I actually used speech on a computer. It wasn't a desktop computer. I started using speech on a computer back in probably the early 80s, we had a system called the VERT system. Yeah, the VERT system, and the system would actually, it would sit between a mainframe computer and the terminal. So all the data would come in through the VERT, and and you'd have the terminal had the VERT would handle all the data coming through into the terminal, and then when you type stuff, it would go back out through there. So the VERT would actually do the speech generation. But the first PC, I'm trying to think, probably the early 90s, I think, before we finally did that. Because all the employees before then, we had terminals on our desks that were connected to the main computer. And then when the PC came along, that's when that's when I started using JAWS, the DOS version of JAWS. And that was probably in the 90s, early 90s.
Anybody that hasn't asked a question yet?
I haven't a comment. John, that's to do. When did your father die in 2008?
He did in 2010. He passed away.
Whoa, how old was he?
He was 2 weeks shy of his 92nd birthday.
Whoa, 1918.
Right.
And your mother must have died first.
No, she's still alive. She is 94 now.
Wow.
God bless her. John, I have a question. Are you a licensed ham operator right now?
Yes. Yep. Both Laurie and I are licensed. So.
What was that?
Both Laurie and I are still licensed.
Yeah, I am too. I received mine in 2003. Of course, back then, and probably even today, there is no novice license anymore.
Right.
So who's the bigger ham, you or your wife?
I don't know. Oh, she wants to know define big, if you heard that one. But I got my license. I got my license in 1969. My novice license.
Wow.
In fact, it became.
Do they have to renew those, or
every 10 years?
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Yep. I have my technician.
Yep. So I got my novice in 1969. Got my general in 71. And then I upgraded to extra in 1977. While I was at WPI, I got talked into going into Boston by a few people in the radio club. They said, well, do it now. They said, just approach it like you're studying for another test and do it. So that's what I did.
Yeah.
But I operate probably 95% CW. Morse code, in other words.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Sure. Okay, good time for maybe one more. I know that John is very busy. Well, John, thanks for taking the time to talk to us.
Well, thanks for having me on.
You know, it's very good. Told a great story, and and also thanks for sharing that newspaper article.
Oh yeah.
That you sent me too. That was great too.
Yeah, how'd you like the references to some of the older technology in that article?
Oh yeah.
It was very good.
Yeah, that was a well-written article. I just sat down. The person who wrote it really had a good handle on things, because we sat down and talked for, I don't know, maybe half an hour, and that's what came out of the conversation.
Mhm.
Was well written.
Yeah.
Well, thanks again, and our best to your wife, Laurie, and continued success with all that you do.
Thank you, and thanks again for everyone who called in and listened.
We'll see you soon.
Take care.